Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today. I'm your host, Sharlee Dixon, and today I'm joined by Linden Schaffer. Linden is an award-winning wellness entrepreneur, best-selling author, and expert with over 20 years of experience in the wellness and psychedelic spaces. She is the founder of Reveal, a global online community for women, and the co-founder of the Los Angeles Women's Psychedelic Community, both dedicated to creating safe and informed spaces for exploration and healing. As a member of the Global Psychedelic Society team, Linden advocates for responsible and inclusive practices in the psychedelic movement. Her work has been featured in Forbes, Condé Nast Traveler, and ABC News, and she has spoken on renowned stages like the New York Times Travel Show and Google Talks. Linden is passionate about empowering women through transformation, emphasizing safety, accessibility, and personal agency in all of her work. We're excited to welcome Linden to discuss how psychedelics can be a transformative tool for women's wellness when approached with education, intention, and safety. We'll dive into common misconceptions, the importance of integration, the role of community, and how women identifying individuals can confidently navigate this space. All right, Linden, thank you so much. Thank you for coming to the show. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Sharlee. I'm thrilled to be here.
Absolutely. So before we get into discussing Reveal and your work, can you tell our listeners more about what psychedelics actually are and how they can be used both recreationally and medicinally?
Yes, that is a great question. And every time I answer this question, I need to start out by saying I'm not a medical professional and I'm not a lawyer. So nothing I say here is medical advice or legal advice. You really need to check, with your own providers and where in the world you are listening from, because laws change every day and new research is coming out every day. And so it's important to be informed, which is exactly why I'm here, right? To start this conversation. So yeah, a lot of people come to us and say, what are psychedelics? How do they work? Why would I use them? And to be completely honest, the answer in terms of why would I use them, which I think we'll probably dive into a lot today, is different for everybody. So psychedelics and plant medicine, altered state substances have been around since the dawn of time. Indigenous cultures around the world have used them for various things, and they've shown up in writings, throughout history. And so these aren't necessarily substances that are new. Of course, some of the ones that are developed in a lab are newer, but some indigenous plant medicine has millennia of use, and people use them for various things in terms of altering your state of consciousness. Research has come out to show that certain medicines and substances help with anxiety, they help with depression, they help with neuroplasticity in the brain, they help with women's hormones, right? They help with addiction. There are a lot of different reasons that people use them. And what we like to talk about, if you have the opportunity to watch How to Change Your Mind on Netflix, which is the series that Michael Pollan did, he has this amazing cartoon that kind of explains why people use psychedelics. And I like to refer to this a lot because it gives people a great visual and sort of this level playing field. If you imagine a mountain where snow has fallen and people have been sledding down that mountain all day, and you think of that like your brain, when you get into your 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond, you have these paths that have been placed in your brain through time. So whether that be lived experiences or habits that we've picked up, or even if it's cultural expectations that have been placed on us, right? We've created these grooves kind of in our brain, and without thinking, we go on and we live this way. And someday we might wake up and be like, why am I here? How do I change? And we talk about psychedelics as sort of like a fresh snowfall. So snow has now fallen over those tracks, and the mountain, again, now it's your decision of how do you want to sled down that mountain. And so I think that's a great visual and a great place to start talking about the opportunity of psychedelics and what they can do.
Well, I really, as you were giving that analysis there, I was really thinking about it in my head, and that is actually how like our life goes. We create these paths, and literally, I'm 41. I've been there. You wake up one day like, what am I doing? Why did I make these choices? How am I here? And what do I do to create a new path? So, thank you for that. What inspired you to create Reveal, and how does it specifically support women identifying individuals?
Yeah. It's a great question. And I like to start out again, every talk that I give or every educational session that I give to be very explicit that for those of you who can't see me, I am a white female. And so a lot of what I teach to, and obviously my personal experience comes from that lens. It is
Right.
not the only perspective. And I, like most people in this space, have so much to learn from so many different cultures. So I just want to be clear of where I'm coming from. And it's not the be all end all for any of the conversation that we're having. For me, I have almost 30 years of preparation to get into this field without even really knowing it, right? Talking about looking back and how did you get here? So I've had almost 20 years of working in the health and wellness space in various
Okay.
iterations. I have various certifications, through these kind of
Yeah.
wellness modalities. And for 30 plus years, I now look back at what I've done and how I live my lifestyle as having created this wellness toolbox, right? This box of tools that I need at different times in my life to pull out these tools to help me, whether it's get through the day, feel
Mhm.
better, change my perspective, my understanding. And psychedelics for me happen to be one of the tools that are in my toolbox.
Okay.
Now, this wasn't always the case. I didn't always look at it like this because also I didn't know that I could use them in this way. You mentioned in the beginning recreational versus intentional, which we
Mhm.
can talk about. My experience in the beginning 30 years ago with psychedelics was recreational. It still has a lot of the same effects, right? You look at through a completely different lens, you set up a completely different container, but they became a tool for me 30 years ago. During the pandemic specifically is when I started to see a rise in everyone like at home. You're confronted with who you are. At some
Mhm.
point, we were forced to sit still and whether
Yeah.
we wanted to or not, examine ourselves and our lives. And all of a sudden, it seemed like the mental health crisis skyrocketed,
Mhm.
not
It
because
did.
it wasn't there, but just because more people had time to pay attention to it. And so it was just a pivotal time. It was also around that time where more and more psychedelic research started to be published. So it was this tipping point of people starting to pay attention to the research that was coming out, and the research coming out talking to some of the things we all realized we were feeling. We were living with depression, we were living with anxiety,
Mhm.
and the younger generations have started to see living with depression and anxiety as just a normal symptom of life, right?
Yeah.
Not realizing that there are potentially other options. It was during this time that people started to experiment with psychedelics if they hadn't before, because they're like, well, I'm home and now is a great time, right? If
Yeah.
I'm
Mhm.
stuck somewhere and I'm sort of forced into a setting and I'm not driving and I'm not, doing, social things, it could be a good time to experiment. And it was during this time that I started to see a lot of harm happening, not because of the substances per se, but because there weren't enough resources or education out there for people
Right.
to understand what they were getting into and build what I call a safe container. And
Right.
so I created Reveal sort of in response to that. And the global
Okay.
women's community of Reveal provides education, it provides community. And what it does is it helps people build a foundation for their exploration, especially considering everyone is going to be different and they're going to need a different container based on their lived experiences,
Yeah.
based on literally where they are in their life right now.
Mhm. Mhm. And so then why women specifically?
It's a great question. So, with women specifically, it's always been a population that I have worked with because I've had such a long career in the health and wellness space. When I started in 2008 working in the health and wellness space, it was mostly women by design that were accessing all the programming that I was doing because
True.
women in general at that time tended to be really interested in self-help, in
Mhm.
self-growth, right? In always working on ourselves and improvement.
Yes. Yes.
Also because of our societal expectations of, this claim of you can have it all. You can work, you can be a daughter, you can
Mhm.
be a parent, you
Mhm.
can be a breadwinner, you can be all the things. But the
Yep.
reality is trying to give all of those things equal attention, you burn out like
Possible.
so quick.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's impossible.
Exactly. And so that was sort of just the natural progression of working with women.
Yeah.
The reason that for me it became really important in the psychedelic space specifically is by design, psychedelics are two things. One is they are dysregulating, meaning they will completely dysregulate your system. That is the point, because most people intentionally go into psychedelics because they want to break patterns or change something or heal trauma or whatever it is, which means by design, you have to dysregulate yourself to find your new regulation, number
Mhm.
one. Number two, because these substances put you in an altered state of consciousness, as women, whether we realize it or not, in the back of our heads, and it's not just women, it really is any underrepresented population. In the back of our heads, we are always thinking about, am I safe in this situation? And that word safety means different things to different people. But and obviously you can't generalize 100%, but normally women working in women's spaces, they can quiet that part of their mind. They're not thinking safety.
Sure.
Am I going to be okay? Am I going to have to figure out how to get it out of an inappropriate sexual situation? You
Mhm.
know, those kind of power imbalances, specifically with the genders, whether you're talking about binary genders or more genders, there is a power imbalance. And so therefore, knowing that you are going to enter an altered state of consciousness and have a lot of things that you want to be concentrating on, safety shouldn't be one of those things.
Absolutely agree with you. Absolutely. And so a few minutes ago, you mentioned the difference between using recreationally and intentionally, which I like the use of that word intentional there. And in my experience, it has mainly been, I've only really ever heard people using it recreationally before I started, working with the podcast here. And so I've really started to hear more mainstream media. It's given more attention to that there are other ways to use psychedelics or plant medicine, but there's still such a huge lack of education and expertise. It seems like Reveal is giving some lens to that those lacks there. So, what are some of the biggest misconceptions and myths that people have when approaching this type of medicine?
Yeah. And there are a lot, right? And a lot of
Hmm.
that, especially again, coming from a US based lens, it's part
Yep,
of our culture and
it
has been
is.
part of our culture for decades. So, just to take a step back so people understand where this came from, and maybe you haven't thought about this in a little while if you're listening to the podcast, but in the 70s, the war on drugs, right, is what became, law of our land in the United States. It was the Nixon administration that said that these medicines had a high abuse potential and no medical value. And that is a lie. And we've proven that with research, right? It also was admitted decades later when the people in the Nixon administration said, well, we didn't outlaw psychedelics and substances because of this reason. We outlawed them because of a cultural context, right? And
Mhm.
so, but it doesn't matter. They had great marketing and it stuck, right? All these
Yep,
decades later.
it
And
did.
actually during that time when all of this was outlawed in the United States, there were actually studies underway at that time which had great results. People were using LSD to combat alcoholism, depression, and anxiety. And psilocybin and magic mushrooms were being used for depression and existential distress when it came to like terminal illness or grief or things like this. That, fast forward in the 80s and 90s, the DARE program, which many of us remember,
Oh
you're
yeah.
of that age as am I.
Yep.
We lived through this in school, right? This
Hmm.
just say no, you're going to fry
Uh-huh.
your brain, you're going to
Yep.
jump out a
With the
window,
literal eggs in the skillet. Oh yeah.
right? Decades later, we remember
Yep.
those commercials. So they
Hmm.
were brilliant marketers, but again, their facts were wrong. And so unfortunately, culturally, in the context of the United States, this led to a lot of misinformation. It led to mass incarceration. It
Hmm.
led to racial disparities and it led to stifling research and basically a whole lot of suffering because here were these medicines that were coming out in research. Here were these medicines that have been used in ceremonial context in indigenous cultures around the world for millennia. And all of a sudden, you have these white males saying, no, this is going to fry your brain on drugs. And for
Yeah.
whatever reason, that has stuck in our consciousness. And so there is a lot of work to do in terms of education and misconception. Some of it is starting to happen as more and more research comes to the surface. It's starting to happen as more education is brought to the surface around these medicines. Again, I mentioned Michael Pollan and his Netflix special. That Netflix series was based off a book that he wrote about using these substances. There are any number of celebrities these days who talk about it as well. And so, yes, many of us, because these things were banned or outlawed or criminalized, depending where you are, started out with recreational use because, again, stifling the education, stifling this idea of creating a container is what makes people kind of go to these substances for fun and escape and for a one-time use. What we've realized is if you want to use these substances for healing, if you want to use these substances to address how the things that the studies are coming out to say, you can combat depression, anxiety, hormonal changes, all this stuff with these medicines, it's not just a one and done experience. And so it's really important when you talk about intentional use, creating this safe container. And that is the foundation of which I teach on, because it is important to know what you're going to get yourself into. It's also important to know once you start using these medicines, how to deal with what comes up. We talk about in the psychedelic ecosystem a lot. There's two famous sayings. There's many more, but the two I want to talk about is the medicine opens the door. It's up to you to walk through it. That's one thing. The other thing is the medicine gives you what you need, not what you want. And therefore, you need all these tools, one, to be able to walk through that door, and two, to process what comes up. And that's when I teach to intentional use. I teach to setting this container. That's what we mean by intentional use.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor.
Continuing education is both a requirement and a learning opportunity, but finding the right CE provider can be challenging. AATBS, a triad company, offers continuing education for psychologists, social workers, marriage and family therapists, counselors, and behavior analysts. CE courses are available both individually and as part of our new All Access Pass. All Access Pass provides a library of over 250 unique courses. That's more than 800 hours of CEs, with new courses being added every month. As a special offer, Behavioral Health Today listeners can save 15% on CE purchases. Visit us at aatbs.com/BHT and enter promo code BHT15 during checkout. That's aatbs.com/BHT. Check out our library and check off your CE requirements today.
Got you. Okay. And so you actually touched on something that I was going to ask you next. From my context of what I learned growing up and what you just mentioned, a lot of the use of plant medicine was derived into, we're partying, we're having fun, we're feeling loose, we want to experience something different. And it was mainly discussed as being used once, and we do it once and we enjoy it. And then we go back to whatever our regular lives look like. Can you explain to us how people can really use it to integrate into like a true healing journey and not just a one-time experience?
Absolutely. And it's important to understand that there are different settings in which you can use these medicines, and there's different doses in which you can use these medicines. And each of those plays into the experience itself, right? And so let's talk just quickly for a moment about setting. Again, I'm not advocating for one or the other. It's everybody's personal choice of how they choose to interact with these substances, but you can do it at home alone. You can do it at home with somebody watching over you to make sure, safety wise, you're going to be okay. You can do it one-on-one with a guide, somebody, whether they're a therapist who's trained in this kind of medicine or a ceremonial guide or facilitator that has sat in apprenticeship and gone through some lineage training. You can do this in a group of people. You can go into the jungle and do it with an indigenous community. You can go to a retreat center and do it with 80 people. There's so many different settings in which you do these different medicines. I think that's something that's very important for people to understand, number one. Number two, dosage. You need to understand sort of the full spectrum of the dosage. From the smallest dose, which is a microdose, which you've probably heard a lot about. It's been very trendy lately for people to microdose. That is the smallest amount of a substance you can do. It is a subperceptual amount of the substance, and we can talk more about that. And it goes all the way up to a heroic dose. So some people may have heard of things like an ego death, right? That happens in a heroic dose of a medicine. And then there's a bunch of different doses in between. Some people, work with a therapeutic dose, a threshold dose, a psycholytic dose. So there's all these different ways to engage with this medicine. Before you understand what's right for you, you need to understand all these different factors, because some of them might feel scary to one person and might be great for someone else. So I think that is something that you need to understand. I was talking with a guy that's in the Reveal community the other week, and she had this great way that she explains it to people who've never worked with medicine before, which I love. If you think about stepping into a pool, right, in the summer when you want to go swimming, dipping your toes in is a great example of a microdose, right? Starting and getting all the way into the pool, holding your breath, getting underwater and becoming the pool, becoming the water, becoming the walls, becoming the kids playing, becoming the floaties. That is a heroic dose. And so you can kind of use that visual as well to sort of understand, if you check in with yourself, what feels right in that moment, what feels like something you might need. It's not an all or nothing. And then it is through understanding the setting, it's through understanding the dosing, how then you would create your supportive container around that.
Okay. And so speaking of setting, how do you determine or evaluate where that setting should be, or what that perfect setting for you is? Whether it's the retreat, at home, with friends, a clinical setting, how does someone know what is the right thing for them?
Yeah. There's no one setting that's going to be perfect, because there's going to be challenges that arise. And it doesn't mean challenges is not a negative word, right? It's just going to be about what you can handle. Like, how is your nervous system set up? What makes you feel safe, right? I've spoken to people who lived through the 70s and lived through this. Drugs are bad. And therefore, for them, a therapeutic office in a medical setting feels safer to them, because, again, they're dealing with this underlying cultural context. And so that feels safest to them. For someone like me, especially someone like me who's had experience, a medical setting doesn't feel great to me, because for me, I'm using these substances to connect with myself, to be more spiritual, to go inward and show me what I need to work on. And for me, being kind of in a medical setting, it feels too rigid for me to be able to have that kind of experience. So again, you have to start to ask yourself these questions. I teach this information around this framework, which I call the 5 S's of psychedelic safety. And setting is the first S in that 5S framework. I'm sorry, screening is the first S in that 5S framework. And screening is literally asking yourself, what feels safe to me, right? Some people may have not asked themselves these questions before. What would it feel like to be in a group of people, of 80 people, with live music and a bunch of things happening around you, and you have to be there for a week? Like, does the idea of that feel scary, or does the idea of that feel safe? Would you be able to let go and be curious in a situation where you can hear other people around you? Or do you feel more comfortable working one-on-one with someone where you're getting that personalized, individualized attention, and the person sitting in the room with you is only focused on you? They're not focused on a bunch of other people in the room.
Okay. You just touched on my next question. You're so good at this, Linden. So the 5 S's for safety, you touched on the first one, screening. Can you walk us through the rest?
Absolutely. So it was important to me, having been in the wellness space for so long and seeing how people transform, and when they're going through self-growth, or when you create a safe container for them, how they can get then look inward more deeply. And it's easier to address things that are happening, or really listen to what you need in your life when you have this feeling of safety around you. And so that is the foundation for everything that I teach to. The 5 S's of psychedelic safety are screening, setting, support, and sustainability. And I'll quickly touch on each of those. Screening is assessing your psychological flexibility, your stability, your readiness, right? These are all questions to ask yourself, right? What is my home environment like? Is whomever I live with, would I be able to talk to them? about deciding to take this path. That could be very important in the context of your healing. So it's also screening also in addition to internal screening, understanding the wellness tools that you have, understanding, how you deal with triggers and what your nervous system regulation tools are. It's also important to screen for medical contraindications. Each substance has different medical contraindications. Some people are on medication. Some people have history of mental health issues or mental health family issues. So that's important to screen for all of that. The second S is setting. And this is about cultivating your mindset, cultivating a mindset of empowerment and cultivating a mindset of resilience. And sometimes you need to do that before you start working with these medicines. Sometimes you can look at your life and say, okay, my home life is not okay. So I need to really focus on that screening part first before I even take the next step. Sometimes if the screening, everything looks great, you focus on your mindset and you start to think, what is it that I want to get out of working with these medicines? What kind of intention do I need to set and work with? Do I need to focus many weeks on set before I move on to the next step of actually taking these medicines and looking into my setting? Because again, the point of working with medicine is to empower yourself, right? To trust yourself, to trust your intuition, to be able to work with whatever comes up. And if you're in a mindset where maybe you don't trust yourself or you've never been taught to trust yourself, or maybe that feels uncomfortable, you might need to do a little more work in that second S before you move on. The third S is the setting, which we did talk about, designing something supportive, something intentional, something where you're going to feel comfortable emotionally in whatever environment that you're in and whoever you're working with. The fourth S is support. And this is about building that safety net. And it's building that safety net before the journey, during the journey, and after the journey. And building that support structure, it could be different ways you do it in all these different steps. And this is part of the beauty of being in a community like Reveal, is having other people who are experiencing these similar types of things with you to ask questions to ask, hey, how did you deal with when X came up? It doesn't mean what person X did is right for me, but at least I can get a perspective of like, okay, what I'm feeling is normal. Someone else has felt this way before, and really understanding, do you think that you should have a therapist on deck for post experience? Let's say you're not going to work with a therapist for the medicine journey itself, but maybe afterwards, like, hey, I typically process things through talking. So maybe you do need a therapist. Maybe you rather process things by getting in your body. So maybe you need somatic work lined up, or maybe you just need to make sure you're taking a certain amount of time off work so that you have time to process however you need to process. And the fifth step is sustainability, which is ensuring that long-term healing, integration, and growth happens. Because the other thing that I think is a bit of a misconception, especially if people are thinking, oh, these are a one and done experience, is stuff can come to the surface. Going back to the medicine gives you what you need. Stuff can come up that you maybe haven't prepared for. And it could come up in a year from now, right? Or, and it's important to be able to have community. It's important to be able to have integration circles to go to. It's important sustainability wise, when I talk about sustainability in terms of growth and healing, we also have to think, especially if we're using plant medicines that come from indigenous cultures, like how are we sustaining the entire experience from when it started so that it is available to us and to others and to that community in the future. So there's a lot that goes into all of this and building that container. And again, it's going to look different for everybody, but by using this 5S framework, you start to build your personal foundation for exploration that gets you started from a place of safety, empowerment, and as much informed consent as possible.
Nice. Okay. And so you touched on this at the very beginning of our conversation, the women's mental health challenges and how they're often tied to these ideas that we can have it all, do it all, be it all, and be amazing and perfect at all of these things, those expectations like marriage dynamics or to be married, period, or motherhood, and then life transitions such as menopause and what what everyone says or what they say we should do or be, or how we should carry ourselves. How can psychedelics help address these specifically unique challenges and struggles for women?
Yeah. It is something that is a completely under-researched area, and it is being researched more and more. Right now, a lot of the evidence that we have out there is anecdotal, right? Women
Right.
experimenting and women talking about their unique challenges and what happens. The essence of psychedelics, in my opinion, is to help you get back to your core self. Right. With what, taking away whatever's happened to you in your lifetime, however you grew up, whatever experiences you've had, whatever decisions you've made, there is a core self that is within you. And certain things of that core self may change throughout the years, like your value system, for example, right? Something maybe that you valued in your 20s is completely different from something that you value in your 40s.
Absolutely.
But as women, there are societal roles that are placed upon us, whether that's by family, whether that's by culture. Sometimes it's ourselves that place those expectations on us. And what psychedelics allows you to do is kind of choose how you want to show up, choose the way in which you show up differently. So it's not necessarily about solving a problem per se. What it is it's looking at, maybe I'm feeling depressed. Maybe I have PTSD or trauma in my background. Maybe I have some existential distress or anxiety, whether that is because of life transitions. Maybe it is because of hormones, right? These are the types of different phases. Women specifically go through a lot of these different phases, from the time we are young. And so what psychedelics does is allow people to kind of quiet the noise and reevaluate and say, okay, here's how I want to look at something differently. Here's how I want to move through the world with more ease. Here's how I want to show up with more love, in situations like these. When it comes to perimenopause and menopause, there's a fabulous doctor out there, Dr. Allison Fiducia, who is, she talks on this concept a lot, and she is doing the research. She says that women are more susceptible to anxiety and depression during these transitional stages because of our hormone fluctuation.
Mhm.
And so psychedelics can help stabilize mood during these periods of our hormonal changes. So it can alleviate things like, there's a lot of microdosing, women who microdose, right?
Yes.
And we mentioned how microdosing is kind of trendy right
Mhm.
now. And a lot of that's because it can alleviate, menstrual symptoms. It also can improve your mood. So if you are in these hormone fluctuations, it can kind of help regulate you to be like, okay, I don't feel so crazy anymore. I don't feel so internally chaotic anymore. I don't feel like I have memory fog or brain fog anymore, because a lot of these substances, psilocybin specifically or mushrooms specifically, are great for anti-inflammatory. And so a lot of times when our hormones are fluctuating and they're inflaming our body, this is a way to help calm some of that down.
Okay. Okay. And you also mentioned this as well. Speaking of a community, oftentimes, it's in my experience, I'll say women don't always have the community or the space to be able to share the challenges that we are facing every day. Even if you have a group of women that you're friends with, you may not necessarily always be able to share all of your experiences with them. It seems like Reveal steps into that space to help create a safe community for women. Can you talk a bit more about the role that community support can play in ensuring a safe and meaningful psychedelic experience?
Absolutely. And I do think the idea of community has grown out of how we've seen these medicines used in indigenous lineages,
Ah,
right? These
okay.
medicines, when they come from indigenous communities, oftentimes the ceremonial use of these medicines are literally done in community. The kids grow up around elders using these medicines. So by inherent nature, community has been created. You absorb through osmosis, right? Being around, like understanding how these substances work, understanding what life is like afterwards, understanding the ritual and ceremony that goes into it. In the US, specifically in Western culture, we pride ourselves in individualism. And so
Mhm.
therefore, it's why we have this loneliness epidemic that has been
Yep.
talked about for a long time. And so getting back into community when you're using these medicines is super important, because part of what these medicines do is show you how we all connected we are in this world. It shows you, how you're a little speck of such a big world that is out there. And that sometimes can feel scary if it feels like you're alone in that. And
Right.
therefore, community and people going through this work together by nature is supportive. So it's really important in my experience, especially with Reveal. We have women at every stage joining the community, meaning some are in the community that haven't even had a psychedelic experience yet, but they're
Okay.
so curious and they don't know who to go to ask the questions that they have, right? They don't know, where do I get safe resources? Where do I get other people who have done this before who I can ask questions to without feeling ostracized or
Yeah.
weird or othered? So I think it's really important to acknowledge that that is what Reveal is creating, is a safe space for people to ask these questions. We also have people in the community who are using these medicines continuously, whether that's through a microdosing protocol, whether that's through these larger journeys that happen, maybe every through few months or every year or so. And then we have people who facilitate in the community. And so to come from it with all these perspectives where you can ask questions of someone maybe who's been working with with certain medicines for years, or someone who's been trained by an indigenous community. It's really important, again, because education is empowerment and because
Absolutely.
community can keep you safe, right? Community is, think about it, whether it's psychedelics or not in your own town. We talk about this a lot. Like, before you go to a restaurant, you read reviews or you
Mm-hmm.
ask your friends, like, where was the best restaurant? What kind of experience you had? Like, think about if you were able to do that in this kind of space, how valuable that would be and how much safer it would be. And that's exactly what Reveal is creating.
Nice, nice. And speaking of safety, and you also mentioned this as well, the psychedelic space is largely unregulated. I've heard that there are some legal places popping up in certain states in the US. But so then how do people know what is reputable? What are the red flags that people should look out for when they're choosing a facility or a retreat to use, or even a facilitator to listen to?
I think it's great to have a healthy dose of skepticism when working with these substances, regardless of the medicine that you're choosing. I think it's important to acknowledge that no space can be guaranteed 100% safe, right? Whether you're talking about going into a therapist's office, whether you're talking about going to the dentist, or whether you're in like a surgery where they give you anesthesia, there's some level of trust that has to happen, because if you're being put either in an altered state of consciousness or in a situation where there is inherently some kind of power imbalance, you need to be able to trust what is happening. So in the psychedelic space specifically, I talk about how transparency is key. Whether it's a facilitator or a retreat center, if someone hesitates to share details or dismisses questions that you have about safety or their emergency plan, for example, like, that's a huge red flag. The goal is to
Yeah.
want to keep you safe. And that is a very important part of their job. Also, if someone doesn't share about their own experience, like how long they've been sitting with medicine or serving medicine, or whether they were given permission from that indigenous lineage, if they don't answer these questions, or if you feel like they're sidestepping the question, I think that is also a red flag. The goal with working with these medicines is to get you to a place where you don't need these medicines anymore. And so if somebody is telling you only they can help you, only they know the magic plan and it has to be XYZ, like, that is also a red flag. You have to
Yeah.
be careful to come into these kind of cult dynamics or power dynamics that can happen, because many people come into these experiences wanting healing. So they are turning some of themselves over to somebody else. And so it
Yeah.
is really important to be able to talk about, if you need therapy, if you want to have an independent integration plan, right? The person that you're working with should encourage you to heal in the way that feels safe for you. They are there to guide these medicines. They are there to guide you, but only you know you. So I think
Right.
it's really important to be able to lean into that. And again, it's why I talk a lot about preparation and why Reveal really stands firmly on preparation being the foundation. Because if you don't know your options or you don't know what's right for you, then you will give that power over to somebody else to make those decisions for you. And it might not be the right decisions for you. I think it's also very, very important for people to talk about the risks, the potential harm and adverse effects and challenges that can happen. On a scale of when looking at like alcohol and tobacco and things like this, when it comes to safety on people's physical health, mental health, and social harms, psychedelics are at the bottom of that scale, meaning the least amount of harm caused to yourself and others, whereas things like alcohol,
Hmm.
heroin, and tobacco are at the top of that scale. And so I think it's
Okay.
very important to discuss like nothing is harm-free or risk-free, but I think
Hmm.
it's important to acknowledge, yes, XYZ could potentially happen, but if we're doing the screenings properly, if we have safety protocols in place for the medicine time, if we have an integration plan set up in advance and that support system created in advance, then we really are working to mitigate the risk and the harm.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you. So, looking ahead, how do you see the role of psychedelics evolving in women's health and mental health care?
Yeah. Again, I'm hoping more research is coming out. More and more women are fighting to get these things researched. Women in general are underrepresented in most scientific studies, right? And
Yep. Yep.
especially women of minority, like really, really low percentage. And so there are people working in this space that are advocating for more research. I think a lot of people in the medicine world also advocate women specifically of my body, my choice. And so
Yes.
we've been talking about how these medicines are illegal. In some places, they are decriminalized, meaning they're a much lower priority for law enforcement, and like personal use is, people kind of look the other way, which means that these medicines are readily available. And I think women are saying like things, like the pharma medications I'm on either are not working or they've stopped working or I'm still struggling
Side
and I'm on
effects.
those. Like, what else are my options? And so
Hmm.
I think for women, advocating for this and really, really understanding like you can go through these life transitions, you can have hormonal imbalances, and you can learn to get emotional regulation. And so, my hope is that we continue to advocate as women, we continue to keep each other safe as women, and we continue to have more research comes out because the research up until this point has only provided positive results on the way that it can impact women's healthcare.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It only took a short Google search for me to find so many different articles and different references for speaking to the positivity of psychedelics, especially in women. So I'm with you. I agree that waiting for the more studies to come out, I think it's only going to be positive for us. So you have a new course launching this fall. What can listeners expect and how can they learn more about Reveal and your work?
Absolutely. So the best place to find us is on our website, which is revealcommunity.world. And once you head to our website, you will have more information that you can find on Soul and Substance, which is our 6-week women's course. I also offer one-on-one coaching because Reveal is a private vetted women's community, which is where Soul and Substance takes place. I offer one-on-one coaching through that 5S framework, or you can book a single session as like an Ask Me Anything. And that's for all genders. So it is not exclusive to women. On the Reveal community, you'll also see we often do a lot of free events and free education through the form of webinars. And so we're always changing what kind of events that we have. So that's a way for you as well if you want to get on our mailing list and then get invitation to our free events. The course that we have is called Soul and Substance, and it's actually a 6-week women's course, which is hybrid learning. And so it's a mixture of live, in person with guest speakers, integration circles, and then online work of self-paced videos, workbooks, and quizzes. In September, it's actually our 3rd cohort that's launching. So we have some under our belt already, and the results have been really positive because it is all around safety and preparation. I mentioned, getting in the screening session, talking about medical contraindications. We have a
Mhm.
doctor of pharmacy who's a guest speaker in our course. And it's a way for people to come and ask all their medical questions, whether it's substances they're on, whether it's mental health questions. We actually had someone come on, one of our past participants, specifically about hormones and perimenopause and how could this help? And
Mm.
so it's another great way for us to have these conversations live. We also have an IFS therapist, which I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with IFS or internal family systems work,
Mhm.
because psychedelics brings up different parts of us. Sometimes they show us parts that have been repressed or parts that
Yeah.
we trying to ignore. And if you don't understand what that is, that can be a very scary and destabilizing experience. So again, being able to have an IFS therapist there to ask the questions, to talk through potential things that might come up is really important. And we also do have a microdose educator and mushroom cultivator who is part of our course. And again, all women.
Yeah.
Yeah, all women. And so it's a great way, again, for people who are entering. We have it tends to be half and half of who enters this course. Again, women who've done some research and are kind of ready to take the next step, but they're not sure where to start. This is a huge jumping off point for them to feel safe and start to create that container for themselves. And then we have other women who've done it recreationally or maybe had one intentional experience and it didn't, quote unquote, do what they wanted, or it felt off and they weren't sure why. And then once they've gone through our programming, they say, oh, I didn't ask myself enough questions. I didn't set my intention properly. I didn't vet my facilitator properly, right? A lot of things that they kind of come out the other side, maybe having one or two experiences and saying to themselves, I wish I knew this and I wish I knew that. And then they take our course and they say, oh, I should have done this first.
Nice. Nice. Okay. Well, I know my listeners are looking forward to checking out your website and the rest of your work. But Linden, I have really appreciated speaking with you today.
Thank you so much, Sharlee. This has been wonderful.
And thank you to our listeners for taking the time to join us. Make sure to follow us on social media at Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, and even on YouTube at Behavioral Health Today. And make sure that you give our show 5 stars and leave us a review. That helps our show get discovered and share the valuable insights in each episode. As always, the resources for this episode and an archive of all of our other episodes can be found on our webpage at triadhq.com/BHT. And we look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Triad Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.